The first one is about lead. What do you do with, quote, normal levels that are not zero, and how do you reassure worried parents?
That's a great, like levels of like 1, 2, 3?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. I would make sure you ask the questions. If they're at low risk, they don't live in older housing stock, there's not a parent who does an occupation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then I personally probably would not screen again unless they have Medicaid and are required to be screened. But again, it's risk communication, and you tell them why you're testing, and that there is, with all these other, environmental things that you guys as primary health care providers, I talked about, nurturing environment, et cetera, your child's gonna be okay, all right? And I was a little bit concerned myself when the CDC lowered that level to 5. Yes, there's some evidence there, but I think there also has to be some practical understanding of how you communicate risk. And that can be very tricky, all right? But I think you guys have established relationships, with your patients, et cetera. But the effects are multifactorial, okay? And I think knowing this, you're preventing further elevation if there potentially is a source. These are tough conversations to have. But that's how I would approach it, because I would reassure, knowing if there were no other risk factors. I would reassure, because I think that these children are going to do okay. I worry mostly about the ongoing low-level exposures of 20, 30, et cetera, where it's been going on and no risk or harm reduction has been taken.
Great, thanks. So lots of questions about Juuls. And I'm going to put you on the spot because several people are asking, what does it taste like? Do you know?
So for disclosure, I've never tried it myself, so I don't have personal experience on the taste. But again, it came in many, many flavors for some time, and essentially, it really, because it's nicotine salts that don't have that sting, really it does taste like the flavor that you're buying. And so now the only flavor that's available as of November is the menthol or mint flavor, and then there's the traditional tobacco flavors. There's two. There's Virginia tobacco and then tobacco. So now it's meant to mimic basically what is available for cigarettes. It tastes like those, because still, general reports are that it's just a smoother toke than you get out of a cigarette.
And then a lot of questions about so a pod is equivalent to 20, has the nicotine equivalent of 20 cigarettes. How long is a pod supposed to last?
Yeah. So it is variable on how long you inhale. So the way the Juul works is there's no button to push. Like the original vape pens, you push a button and it lights up, and then it's time to inhale. With Juul, it's just triggered by your inhalation. So if you take a really long inhalation, you're going to have fewer puffs in that pod versus shorter ones. But generally, it's estimated that one pod is about 200 puffs.
This is about lead. Are there any recommendations for screening pregnant women?
That's a great question. There are, and again, it is not mandated, as I understand, in the state of Washington. In New York, it actually is mandated to screen all pregnant women at least once. But again, asking the questions. And again, some pregnant women, you guys may know, exhibit pica behavior. I had a case where a woman was chewing on ceramics from Mexico, and with the lead in the glaze, and had an elevated lead level up to about 65 micrograms per deciliter. And then the neonate was born. But I cannot answer that fully because I don't know what obstetricians do in our state. I can tell you the Department of Health, again, makes a recommendation based on, there is no mandate, right? Okay, yeah.
So several questions about treating a teenager with nicotine addiction. And several of those are asking about the pharmacological agents we use in adults, like Wellbutrin and Gentrix. Any comments on that?
It's a good question that, again, is an area we don't really have much research on what is the most effective methods. And this newer novel method that I talked about, the texting app, is new itself, so we have very little evidence. What we have so far is positive. But generally, it's thought that anything that is used to treat nicotine addiction from combustible cigarettes should be effective for this too. And so I talked about nicotine replacement therapy, but Wellbutrin is something that has been used, so there are reports of that being used to treat it as well. So I think right now we have to treat it the same way that we would treat addiction to combustible cigarettes. One thing that I'll mention about the worry of teens potentially starting to turn to open systems with the flavor ban and closed systems going on open systems is that when you have open systems, you can actually add more nicotine in the tank as well. So, Jewel, we know how much is in one pod. But when you buy different e-juices that are on the market, they all are very significantly. And some have quite a bit more than Jewel, some have quite less than Jewel. It's all over the place. But you can also just add nicotine content and make much higher concentrations than you get from Jewel as well. So we worry about the addiction getting even worse.
Regarding lead, can you speak to the accuracy and reliability of the point-of-care lead testing device that we use?
It depends on which one you have. That's a great question. And I'm going to preface answering that by saying, word on the street is, but this has been the word for 2 years, that the CDC wants to lower the action level to 2.5, which I personally don't think is a good idea, only because the precision of your measurement tool cannot be that accurate. Right now, the one point-of-care testing machine, and the CDC did a great webinar on this. It's usually within about 1.5 to 2. I don't know the ones that you guys are now using. Is that what you're being told? I don't know which one Swedish has.
The trigger point, it's under 3, or if it's above 3, then it gives you a number.
Yeah. So about 2.5. And so you have to be very, very careful. That's really a very, very insightful question. And that's my concern. If they lower it again, and first of all, there's no money to do any prevention activity associated with that, but also the precision of the machine. And about 10 years ago, there were a lot of point-of-care machines that, again, there wasn't a lot of good quality control on them. And so now I think people realize that, and certainly if there's a market, elevation, a venous blood test needs to be done to confirm it. And we all know in pediatrics that's tough to do initially, so if you can do a capillary, that's great. But just understand, but then I know the newer machines that are out it's about 2.
So we have 3 questions about the THC vape products. And one is, do they have nicotine in them? And 2, do we know what the percentage of teen users are of those?
Some do have nicotine in them, most don't. So there are some products available where you actually do have combination, but the majority are either marketed as being THC or being nicotine. We don't have good data on teen use right now. There's no formal survey like we have for the National Youth Tobacco Survey. We don't have a survey like that for teen use of the THC products. So we don't have good data. Some states and local jurisdictions have done some of that. We don't have that data here in Washington either.
So, and a couple of questions about targeted lead screening in clinics that are in high-risk areas and the current recommendation of 1 and 2 years, would you ever recommend screening more often than that?
It depends on what your first lead test comes back at. And again, sometimes, you know, and it depends on the risk factors too. Because really the ultimate goal is any child who has an elevated lead level, the most important and the very first question that we try to ask when we get these calls, do you know the source? You have to take a history to find out where the lead is coming from. And sometimes that's a lot easier said than done, especially if kids go to multiple places, daycare, et cetera, and there's strict rules about daycare. But when to screen, again, really depends. And that one document I showed you actually has really nice recommendations. That was the PACU. If it's greater, you know, if it's between 5 and 10 and it's low risk, you know, repeat the screen in 3 to 6 months. And you have to use your judgment. You know, if the child is living in a house with deteriorating paint and there's dust everywhere and it's a rental unit, okay, it may take a month or so before they can find new housing. It's not just, you know, that easy for a family to get up and move. And that gets into a whole nother can of worms in terms of rental units. There's strict laws about that. Whether they're all being obeyed is another question. But I haven't found that to be as big of an issue in Washington State, but maybe you guys have more experience with that. But it's determining the source and eliminating the source, and then do you need to, you know, rescreen in 3 months or 6 months? If it's right on the cusp, you know, if it's 6 or 7, well, first of all, you shouldn't have it. So, you know, did they just come back from China, a vacation in China where the air is polluted with lead? You may wait 6 months, you know. So it all depends on the situation.
Few more lead questions. Do you know the lead content of aviation fuel?
No, I do not.
And
I
then,
wonder if that's related to the Boeing and people who live around Boeing.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I don't know.
South Park.
Or SeaTac, Burian. No. I don't know the answer.
And then there's a question about, so there's been a lot in the news about lead in the water at Seattle Public Schools.
Right.
And how would you advise patient and families to mitigate the risk from potential exposure?
Well, it depends on the school, because several schools who have done water testing, it falls below the threshold. And I know that one of our legislators, and I'm just being independent here, because the Washington Poison Center's up in Northgate, and that particular legislator, who also is advocating for Representative Paulette, is introducing a bill about lead in school water and about lowering the threshold for action. And again, what a lot needs to be, well, in my opinion, what needs to be done is we don't drink from those fountains, or we replace the fixtures. It's all due to the fixtures or the solder in the fixtures. And there's ways to mitigate that. Like if in the homes, like when I, you know, was in New England, we would tell parents, you turn on the water for 10 minutes, or you buy a filter, because it'll flush all the standing water, because just about every home in Boston had leaded pipes, all right, except for the brand new construction. And again, we weren't as much into bottled water back then as we are into now. But it depends on the school, and every school most of the school water has been tested, most of the schools in King County, not all of them. But actually, there's only a few where the lead concentration has exceeded the EPA concentration.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes here. So I'm going to read this question. The person who wrote it might need to clarify, but we'll see if Dr. Thakkar can answer it. How is e-cigarette use related to increased use of combustibles if the percentage of the latter has decreased so dramatically and e-cigarettes increased?
I think if I understand correctly, I think the question is why is e-cigarette use leading to an increase in combustible cigarette use? And I think comes back to what I talked about earlier when I talked that, for one thing, using e-cigarettes is normalizing the behavior again. And in teens, risk-taking behavior builds on itself. And so as teens start to use e-cigarettes and then start to get a pleasurable response to those, then they do oftentimes then seek other sources of nicotine as well. And will start to move on to combustible cigarette use. And because I think people thought when e-cigs came out that it would just continue to lower the use further. And what we saw was the opposite in our youth, that actually youth are going on to use combustible cigarettes. And we have the data there, those couple studies that I shared with teens in LA being 4 times as likely to use combustible cigarettes within a year of starting e-cigs. And the people in their lower 20s in Connecticut 8 times as likely within a year to use. So the data really does support that teens are moving on to it. And we think it really is because of that normalizing of behavior and then the addiction that develops. And going back to the previous question too, asking about, can THC and nicotine be vaped together? Again, say, in the open systems, that's going to happen. So in the open systems, you put in what you want to put into the tank. And so while it's not very common in the pre-fill cartridges, I think it is more common in the open systems and probably will continue to become more open.
Great, thank you both so much. That was fantastic.